Welcome to the podcast, Whiskey and a Map. Stories of adventure and expeditions as told by those who live them. I'm your host, Michael Reinhardt. It has been said that many adventures and expeditions start simply with a map and a glass of whiskey, a desire to go and see the world's wild places. You're invited to pull up a chair, pour yourself a glass of your favorite whiskey, and join us as we hear stories from another one of our friends just returned from the field. Welcome to the podcast. I'd like to introduce you to a friend of mine, Dr. John Hall. John is a rare combination of serious academic and skilled mountaineer. He is a research professor in the field of environmental sciences, a founding director of the Mountain Environments Research Institute at Western Washington University, as well as the co-founder and executive director of the American Climate Science Program. He has led dozens of expeditions on 5 continents in extreme locations, from deep caves to tropical rainforests, deserts, and to the world's highest mountains. He is a lifetime fellow of the Explorers Club in New York City, a certified scuba rescue diver, and has spent many years with search and rescue teams. John is also the author of the book Icefall: Adventures at the Wild Edges of Our Dangerous, Changing Planet. John, welcome.
Thank you.
Now, a little bit later, we're going to be talking about an expedition you took in 2014 to the Himalayas, a research expedition, and those high mountains nearly killed you. But first, I want to take a few minutes before we hear about that experience and understand what led you to being there. Now, the combination of mountaineer and research scientist, both those by themselves require extraordinary commitment, dedication, and hard work, but you combine the two. First, mountaineering. What got you started in mountaineering?
Well, I think with mountaineering, you love it, from childhood. And I was a kid growing up in Georgia when we didn't have really that many mountains, but I just was always entranced by the books and magazine articles and everything else about climbing Mount Everest and all of the high mountains of the world. And you just start out in Boy Scouts when you've learned to rappel and sort of do some of that basic climbing. Sometimes something gets in your blood, and for some people it's music, for some people it's other things. For me, it was mountaineering. So
you've been climbing since early age then?
Well, like I said, I grew up in Georgia, so we did a little bit in Boy Scouts, but there just wasn't that much of an opportunity back east. And I did, went to Duke undergrad, then Georgia for law school. So that whole time back east, I sort of dabbled very slightly, but there wasn't the mentors, there wasn't the opportunities to do a lot of climbing. But then when I started working on my PhD at University of Arizona in Tucson, there was rock everywhere and everyone climbed. And so suddenly, this kind of side of me that I hadn't really had a chance to explore, because I'd played on the rugby team and played volleyball for Duke and so forth. So I did a lot of sports back east, but it was once I moved to the West and had that opportunity, I kind of pivoted almost 360 and really dedicated myself to those kind of outdoor pursuits.
Now in Arizona, was that mostly technical rock climbing?
Yeah, a lot of, mainly trad rock climbing. I'm trying to think if I ever climbed any ice in Arizona. I don't think I did. And traditional rock climbing using gear is kind of the best foundation for all climbing, because you learn how to set anchors, you learn how to put gear and belays and other things that you trust with your life. And in the case of Arizona, there's a lot of big, long climbs. And so you do things like hanging belays and other things that really give you a good background for when you go into the high mountains.
Then what led you into the high mountains?
That is an interesting question. As I said, I always was kind of interested in it, but as an academic, it's not an easy thing. You either sort of choose, all right, I'm going to, be a guide and live in the mountains, or I'm going to have a career. And not the guiding isn't a career, but, if you want, I guess, to have insurance and retirement benefits when you are older, you choose something different. And so in academia, there wasn't that many opportunities until I applied for and got a Fulbright fellowship to Nepal. And so I'd been very interested in the high mountains and had done a lot of rock climbing and had done a little bit of ice climbing in preparation, and dabbled with some of the Mexican volcanoes and a few things down in South America. But it was all just sort of, tentative. But then when I got the Fulbright, I was able to go for a full year into Nepal. And I spent that year taking Nepali graduate students into the mountains. And basically we would go in for a month, and I would take them out there, show them how to collect. Well, they knew how to collect plants, and we would show them how to take the plant data, the vegetation data we collected, and relate it back to satellite remote imagery. So using satellite remote sensing. And that combination was something that they just had never done before. Like I said, they'd spent a lot of time in the field, but combining it with kind of the bigger picture of satellite remote sensing. And so I spent an entire year doing that. And it was great because I would go with the students and we would collect samples up to a base camp. And then they would kind of collect in the base camp, and I would duck off for 2 days and run over and climb first it was a 6,000 meter peak, or 5,000 meter peak, then a 6,000 meter peak, and sort of slowly got higher and higher peaks. And then as my time was ending, I got lucky because the whole time I had been there, I'd had to hire a local Nepali company, and these 5 Sherpa brothers. Well, it was actually 7 Sherpa brothers, but only 5 of them were guiding. But still, it was a family affair. And they had handled all my logistics. And so when they got 2 clients to go to Everest, they knew I'd been spending a lot of time in the mountains and that I was, super fit and everything. And so what they did was they offered me the opportunity to go and collect data as well as help kind of guide and work with these 2 guys on Mount Everest. So I basically got to go essentially just for the cost of the permit, which was a wonderful opportunity for an academic. We don't have money. So being able to do Everest that inexpensively was incredibly lucky. And so, just that Fulbright really, like I said, 5,000, then 6,000, then 8,000 before you know it. So it was a great opportunity.
And those mountains kept calling you to go higher and higher?
Exactly. Well, when I was a kid, I always wanted to do the Iditarod, do the Ironman, and climb Mount Everest. Those were sort of my 3 goals when I was in middle school and high school. And Everest was always there. And when the opportunity arose, there was no question. I didn't even have to think about it.
Let's go to the academic part of your life. What led you down this path of environmental science and research?
Well, so I think like a lot of people, you go to undergrad and you just have no idea what you want to do. And not really knowing, I sort of waffled back and forth. And so I basically took a track that allowed me to go to law school, as well as took a bunch of environmental classes because I had always been interested in climbing and being outdoors. But I wasn't sure what the environmental classes had to offer in terms of job prospects. So I went to law school just to kind of get a different feel for, I guess, how things get done. And I'm super glad I did, because until you go to law school, you don't understand how regulations dictate everything about life. I mean, the size of the door for your car, the type of glass that's in a shower stall. And so it was a huge kind of awakening of, all right, if you want to get things done, if you want to protect the environment, you have to understand the regulations and you have to have the evidence to make that happen. What I realized was, lawyers aren't scientists. And so if I wanted to make kind of a difference in the environmental field, I couldn't just be a lawyer. I also had to, be able to collect the data I needed to prove my point. And so that's why I went and got my PhD after law school. And so I looked at a lot of different types of fields. And for the most part, a lot of science is about small scale stuff. How this fungus is impacted by different soil types, for example. And when you think about how you can make a difference from a policy standpoint, those tiny studies don't make that big of a difference. And so what I did was I began working with satellite remote sensing, because rather than looking at a single plant or a single, square meter, you're looking at hundreds of square meters or thousands of square miles, depending on the size of the satellite imagery that you're using. And so I loved it because it gave me concrete numbers, which is something you can take into a courtroom or into a policymaking arena. It allowed me to look at things at kind of a regional scale. But the most important thing is when you're taking satellite imagery, looking at it from a satellite down, you're not sure what you're seeing on the ground. So it also meant I had to go outdoors, and I had to spend a lot of time collecting ground data that I could then relate back to the satellite imagery. So it turned out to be kind of a perfect marriage for me of something that gave me potentially policy legal outcomes, and yet meant that I had to go out in the field and collect a lot of field data.
How are you able to combine your academics with your mountaineering?
When you look at environmental change, it's not happening in the places where everyone lives and studies. Instead, it's happening, in the Arctic, on the tops of mountains, in the deepest deserts, or the bottoms of the oceans. And so I realized that if I really wanted to do something with the environment that was kind of now rather than 200 years from now with climate change, it had to be somewhere of these more kind of vulnerable environments. And that's why I've worked in caves and deserts and all the places I have around the world, because they're the places where you see change the most directly. And of course, the fact that I love mountains and that they are probably the best natural laboratory you have, just like I said, it worked out perfectly. Marriage made in heaven. So
let's go to that first climb on Everest. There's something about that climb that still is remarkable. You made that climb without crampons. First, for those non-climber friends of ours, what are crampons?
Well, so back in, there's a real famous case back in the, I want to say it was the 1930s or 40s. People were trying to climb the Eiger in, no, it wasn't the Eiger. It was one of the mountains in the Alps. And an ice storm came in and put ice on the rock. And because they had no way to really stick on the ice, all of these super famous climbers died back in the day. And that actually, one of the guys who was lost some friends was a guy named Vibram, who created Vibram rubber. And so that changed how we began looking at footwear for climbing. I'm sorry, I feel a little historical here, but I just thought it was really interesting. And so from there, we got rubber to stick on the rock, but in the past, they would just hack steps out and use hobnail boots. And what we've done with crampons is we've taken the idea of a hobnail boot or spikes on the bottom of your boot and allowed you to have the rubber for when you have the rock, so you have the Vibram sole. And then if you hit the ice, you can just attach the spikes so that you can remove them back and forth. And so that gives you a lot more flexibility. So basically, crampons are just adding spikes to the bottom of your shoes, and they're vicious. I mean, they're an inch longer sometimes. I always looked at them and thought if you were making a horror movie, you could have somebody who would kick somebody with a pair of crampons on. But like I said, a lot of those early people didn't have that technology. And so when you look at someone like Mallory, who potentially was the first person to summit Mount Everest, he wouldn't have had those crampons on. And so when I got to Everest and was climbing it, I quickly saw that the snow was gone. I mean, I've looked at all these historical photos and like the second step and all these things. They used to have these ramps of snow. And now the snow is just gone. It's all bare rock kind of everywhere. And so when I got there and started climbing, and I realized pretty quickly that, this is all rock. It would be a lot, in some ways, easier for a rock climber like me to climb without the crampons. And the thing with the crampons is they're kind of a safety thing. I mean, they're if you're wearing just boots, you're more likely to slip. And so if you're at altitude and you're worried about, losing your ability to function properly, having that safety net, it's really helpful to have something that'll grab a hold of the rock. But because I had been living there for a year and was really, really well acclimatized, and the climb was super easy for me after spending that much time there, I realized I didn't really need that safety net. And so I wanted to find out, if Mallory could have done it. And granted, it's so much easier now than it was. He was climbing with nothing. I've had people all around me because there was probably 30, 40 people that summited the same day I did, kind of in front and behind. So I wasn't alone like he would have been. But at the same time, I was wanting to see, from a boot standpoint. And the other thing is if you can climb Mount Everest without crampons, that says a lot about climate change. And I was up there at over 8,000 meters in just a light shirt. So I just had on effectively just the, kind of a R1 insulated shirt, long sleeve shirt. I had my down suit all the way unzipped. I had my down suit open so that all I had was just a pair of lightweight legging, kind of insulated pants. And that was it. And so for it to be that warm, because there's so much solar radiation, you're so high, to me, it was, like I said, just an incredible evidence of the changes that are going on around the world because of climate change. And
was there something about Mallory that also inspired to climb without crampons?
Yeah, exactly. Like I said, I wanted to see if he could have done it, how difficult it would have been. And certainly with the ice, it would have made a big difference. But because I know he had to cut steps. I just wanted to know if it could be done.
And you made it to the top?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was super great. Yeah, and I was lucky because I reached it right just after sunrise. And the last couple of years before I got up there, it had been really foggy and cloudy and really poor summit conditions. And so digital cameras were kind of coming along really quickly at that point. And so basically, the year I was there, I was one of the first people who had a really good digital camera. At the same time, there was really good visibility. And so I came back and published a bunch of my pictures in various places, and people had never seen anything like it. I made it to the top without any crampons on. I'm like spinning around, taking pictures everywhere. It was kind of one of the most perfect days ever. And that's one of the reasons I've had such a great long-term love affair with Everest, is because that first time was so, so incredible.
Caving. What is a mountaineer doing going inside the earth and into a cave? Tell us about that.
Well, if you live back east where there's no mountains, caves are vertical mountains. I mean, it's mind-boggling. You'll go and there's 1,000-foot walls underground. And so you can rappel down them, and unfortunately the rock's pretty lousy, so you don't do a lot of climbing, but a lot of times you do have to climb. So if you'll crawl along a cave passage and you reach one of these, they call them wells if you're looking down, or domes if you're looking up. And so, yeah, I got in one and looked up and was like, holy moly, this is incredible. Yeah, I lived in Kentucky, and so I would spend for a few years, and I would spend kind of summers or whenever I could out in Yosemite. But then when I was on board on the weekends, I'd get in those caves, because it really is. I mean, it's underground mountains is what I used to call it, and it's can be incredibly impressive. Crazy how vulnerable you are, and especially when you start doing things like cave diving. I've done some cave diving, and I kind of quit because I went to an International Cave Congress in Greece, and I was traveling around. We were traveling around a little bit, visiting some caves, and I was with this, shared a room with this British cave diver. He was pretty famous, well known. I basically, he was dying of lung cancer. And I was like, when I found out, I was sort of like buying him a beer and, told him, it's just terrible and everything. He's like, not really, because all my friends are dead. I was like, what do you mean? And he's like, because I'm a, extreme cave diver, over the years, every person I've cave dived with has died. And so I'm just the last of the group. And it was like, whoa. And so, like I said, I had done some cave diving before that, but I grew a lot less interested in it because there's just some crazy, terrible stories. But at the same time, when you're in a cave and you can actually float when you're diving, it's so amazing because there's so many times you'll be in a cave, you're like, oh, I wonder what's up in that ledge. And you can never get up there. But when you're diving, you just swim up and go check it out. So, caving is, it seems like fun a lot of times for the people who just go in for like a day trip. But once you start adding in diving and some of the serious climbing and so forth, then it changes dimensions really quickly.
In 2014, you went on an expedition to Nepal, an expedition that almost killed you. What was the goal of that expedition?
Since I had gone in 2010 is when I climbed Everest before, and I collected a bunch of rock samples and snow and other things while I was on that climb. And so my idea with most of my research is to revisit areas. So go and collect as much data as possible, and then go back 5 years later or 10 years later and so forth. And so the idea was to go back 5 years later and also to climb it from the other side. So I climbed it from the Tibet side the first time, and I was going to come back and climb it from the Nepal side. And this time the first time it was just me actually doing the climbing. And this time I brought a team of 6. And the idea was because there would be a lot more of us, we could collect a lot more snow. We brought spectrometers and a lot of other gear so we could collect a lot more data. And so that was the overall goal. I got money from the National Science Foundation and a bunch of other groups. Again, my friends, the Sherpa brothers, helped organize the logistics. And so I also brought a bunch of Nepali students. And so as we were trekking in, we were interviewing the locals on climate change and doing a lot of plant sampling, collecting vegetation and water quality samples and so forth. So really trying to maximize the value out of it. And it was the idea one of the reasons Mount Everest is such an awesome place is, first of all, it's one of the few mountains that goes up into the actual stratosphere. So you're getting a lot of long distance transport when you start looking at things like black carbon transport or dust moving around in the atmosphere. The other thing is because it's got India on one side and China on the other side. So depending on which side of the mountain you're climbing, you get different pollution sources. And you can kind of compare the two largest clusters of humanity on Earth and see how they're kind of differentially affecting the air around them. So that was the idea, was we was going to do a comparison of the two sides and the two major countries on either side.
And if I understand correctly, part of this was you were collecting snow samples.
Yep. And the reason, because snow is such an incredible way to look at what's in the atmosphere. If you've ever had a cup of water and left it out for a week or two, it kind of gets that little coating of dust on it, right? And so the same thing happens with snow. It's just a little surface that anything that lands on it's going to stick. And so it allows, between each snowstorm, basically you collect snow for a while, and then you get another layer of dust, and then another layer of dust. And over time, you can get ice cores that have annual resolutions of what happened for that year's climate. But what we look at is more short term. What is those top layers of snow? What's happened in the last year or 2 years or 5 years? And so we try to revisit places often enough that we can compare and see how things have changed over the last few years. And so that was the idea, was to go back and just effectively collect snow all the way up the mountain.
You get to base camp. What happened?
Well, so when you get to base camp, one of the first things that you normally do is you hold a puja. And that's a Buddhist ceremony of blessing to ask effectively the mountain for its permission to climb and ask it not to kill you effectively. And so it was really difficult that year. A lot of people felt morally conflicted. Some guy trying to get famous, and he was going to wingsuit off the summit. And so there was very highly commercialized. They must have gotten somebody cheap because they were utterly unscrupulous. And Yeah, it just, the whole feel that year was kind of gaudy, and it just, everyone, the Sherpa and especially the kind of Buddhist monks along the way, everyone felt like it had a really weird feel to it. And so we had that puja, again, open to kind of smooth everything out. And normally the puja's, it's kind of a nice, bright, sunny day. And so you feel good about what's happened in the puja. But this one was kind of rainy, and it was sleety and just overcast. And again, no one felt great about the puja either. But we thought, well, let's just go ahead and push on. I knew most of the guys I was climbing with. I was at base camp, but the rest of my team was actually still further down the mountain. They were kind of acclimatizing more slowly, and I had just gotten up there to help get things moving along. So by the time they got up there, we could get moving. And so normally you have the puja, and then the next day, all the teams send their teams up. And so, again, everyone left at 2, 3 in the morning and began climbing. And so what happened was, about 3/4 of the way up through the ice fall, you reach a point where you come really close to the kind of north ridge of Everest, or I guess it's the west ridge of Everest. And there's a lot of cliffs above you. And so what happened was, the route kind of came below those cliffs, and a giant chunk just fell off and hit the teams. And normally if a giant chunk fell off like that and hit people, it'd only kill 1 or 2 people, because everyone's normally very spread out. But the thing that was terrible about that day was, right below that overhang, one of the bridges had slipped. One of the, those ladders that you always see pictures of people climbing. Well, one of those, the end had slipped. And so they had stopped, and somebody had to climb across, and they were resetting it up and everything. And so people just kept coming and coming and coming, and this huge backlog of people developed right underneath the ice fall. And so in front of where I was, our guy who was kind of the leader of that day, the Sherpa leader, he got up there and immediately took a look and was like, oh shit, we can't be underneath this. And so he told all of our guys, just throw your stuff down and run for it. In the meantime, they'd gotten the ladder back up. And so 3 of my guys had gotten across, and one of them was basically on the ladder when it broke. And so the guy who was on the ladder got killed, and we didn't know what happened to everybody else. Basically everyone sort of scrambled. We all kind of met back in base camp slowly over time. And basically, just spent the whole day trying to figure out who was alive and who was dead. And that bodies would come, helicopters came in pretty quickly, and they began helicoptering the bodies out. And so, it was just a horrific, horrific day.
So one of your parties is killed crossing that ladder bridge. How'd the other teammates fare?
In terms of injuries, nobody was injured, but Ashman, who passed away, he had a 9-month-old daughter, and he was one of the younger guys, and super, super nice. I had just like a couple hours before been joking with him about racing through the ice fall and who could see, who could get up at the fastest and so forth. He was a super, super nice guy. And, these guys all had known him their whole life and lived with him and climbed with him and were, sharing tents with him and stuff. So it's kind of from an emotional standpoint, and I say that delicately because Sherpa don't typically exhibit emotions at all and are very guarded with their kind of emotions, but they were devastated. That was their good friend, and it could have been them. They were within 100 feet on either side of getting hit by it. So it was incredibly difficult. In terms of physical wounds, no, there wasn't anybody else except him.
But it's a heck of an emotional punch in the stomach. Yeah,
for sure. Well, and actually his roommate or tent mate, Dawa, was the highest ranking, and I'm not sure how they rank, but he actually was a Buddhist priest, monk, and in addition to having summited Everest 5 times. And so it was kind of interesting because my team was all Sherpa. We didn't, most of the teams that are there are, somebody, they're American or European guides, and then they just hire Sherpas. But in my case, it was just, there was all Sherpas, and there was just a few Americans going along with them. And so because we were the Sherpa group, again, this was 10 years ago. Now there's lots of Sherpa groups, but we were the only group. And so basically everyone kind of came to our tent. And so, everybody was upset, and they came to see Dawa. Dawa ended up leading a lot of pujas afterwards as we tried to kind of, celebrate their life and mourn their passing, and then again, try to climb again. So it was a crazy, crazy time to be there, but I felt really lucky to be part of that Sherpa group rather than just, some sterile Western group. So
the accident happens. So what was the next part of the expedition? Were you able to move up on the mountain, or did you have to go to an alternate plan B?
Well, so the idea was to continue climbing. And so in order to facilitate that, NBC offered $100,000 to the families of the people who had died. So because the funeral benefits, basically if you die summiting, or if you die climbing Everest, the funeral death benefit, it was only $450. And so, that's not enough. They got, like I said, he had a 9-month-old daughter, so paying for her school and all. So they offered $100,000, and a lot of other people in the area, we all began getting money together. So we were putting money together, and we were making this fund that we were going to give to the families. And this was the tail end of the Nepali Civil War. So kind of a little background. So back in the 80s, I guess mid-80s, Nepal had a king, and there was a civil war going on that was funded mainly by China. So it was kind of this Maoist communist revolution. And so most of their strength was in rural areas, but especially in the mountains and the national parks. During the Civil War, the Maoists kicked the army and all government functions out of most of the national parks, especially the mountain ones. And the Everest Sagarmatha Park is one of the few where there actually was still a government presence. But the other, Makalu and the rest of them, the Maoists had kicked them out. And so if you wanted to go climb Barun, for example, Brunse, you had to pay the Maoists to allow you to come into their park because they had taken it over. And so the conflict had, the king was assassinated, and the conflict had sort of died down. And they spent like 10 years or 5 years trying to create a constitution. And so there was kind of this void of power for that 5 years. And that was during this time period. And so basically the local Maoists in the area heard, there's $100,000 and more that's going to be given out. And they immediately came to the base camp. And it was weird because you began seeing all these guys in dress shoes and not climbing gear, Nepalis. And they were all part of basically the Maoists brought in a bunch of muscle. And they said they wanted to administrate the money. And so they gave them kind of the first chunk of money, and they immediately, in front of everyone, began handing it out. And because my friend Dawa was the highest ranking Buddhist, they tried to give him $1,000, and he's like, no, this is not our money. You can't do this. And so when everyone realized what was happening, they said, all right, no, the Maoists can't have the money. And the Maoists said, well, if we don't get the money, no one gets to climb, and we'll break the legs of any Sherpa who tries to climb. And so more and more strangers in city clothes began coming into camp. And people started getting beat up in the night. And again, because we were the Sherpa group, everyone would kind of come to our tent and exchange information and try and hide from the Maoists. And so it was really eerie watching all this happen in real time, because it wasn't reported in any of the press or anything. No one, there was little hints occasionally, but, no one was proud of it, I guess. None of the Nepalis were proud of what was happening. And so they didn't really talk much about it. And so anyway, they after they began beating people up, more and more of the teams began leaving. And then towards the end, it was basically my team, because the Sherpa guys were like, you do great work, your science, you're training these students. We really want you to do this work. And then there was a U.S. Army team that was like, hey, we're not getting pushed around by no Maoists. And like one or two other teams that were sort of hanging on. And then the Maoists said, all right, we're going to beat up, break the leg of any Westerner who tries to climb. And once they sort of made that transition from threatening Nepalis to threatening Westerners, that's when my friends were like, all right, yeah, we have to leave. This isn't going to end well. But it actually is ironic, because basically the Maoists sort of threw their entire hand into this, and everyone ended up leaving. They didn't get any money. And everyone was so pissed at how it turned out in terms of, the Sherpas got a little bit of money, but they basically didn't get paid for the year. And all of the businesses that depended on climbing, the locals, they didn't get any money for the year. And so the Maoists basically kind of blew their load and lost. And so after that, the earthquake came the next year, and the Maoists couldn't respond. And so a bunch of foreign aid came in, and basically the Maoists never recovered and totally disappeared. It was very weird, because from 2010 to 2014, the Maoist presence was very strong. It hadn't changed. And then from 2014 to when I was back in 2019, it utterly disappeared. When I was there in 14, there were still hammer and sickles painted on buildings. Basically, if you didn't have a hammer and sickle painted on your building in some places, they would burn it down and so forth. And 5 years later, there was nothing. So incredible amount of change. And that was the event, was them they tried to take over Everest and ended up losing everything because of it.
So you come off the mountain at Everest, but you wanted to continue your work. So where'd you go?
Well, and so that's the way I had a lot of talk with the two Sherpa brothers. One was based in Kathmandu, and the other one is kind of the leader of the team there on the mountain. And so with sat phone and in person, I would talk to the two of them sort of, like, well, what are we going to do here? And they're like, well, we want this, we want you to continue. We wanted to continue. We're doing, this research. I don't know if I told you. Oh, I forgot to tell you. So one of the things we were going to do is we actually had talked to NASA, and they were going to have a satellite come overhead on our summit day on Everest, so that we could have the satellite imagery coming down and we would collect the data up.
Oh, how cool is that?
Yeah, we didn't want to lose all that stuff. So we were like, all right, how can we? And so we started looking around at, we lost a month because of all this posturing back and forth with the Maoists. And so we knew we only had a couple weeks at most. So we were like, all right, we can't do an 8,000 meter peak. It's got to be lower, 7,000 meters. But we still wanted to be on the border, kind of the boundary between China and India, and to have a lot of the same kind of physical characteristics as Everest has in terms of being a somewhat independent mountain, so we could get good data off it and so forth. And again, it had to be somewhere that we could get a permit for relatively straightforwardly in that short a time period. And so we looked around, and we ended up on this mountain called Himlong, which is on the kind of Annapurna Massif. And it actually is a really cool location, because it's when the Tibetan army was fleeing the Chinese invasion, it was the pass that they came through. And actually there's a Tibetan village, I don't know what you call it, a outpost or whatever, just across the border in Nepal from, across the Tibetan border. So basically they got across and just stopped. And that was one of the places where we began our climb there. So we went to what was effectively the same type of location, but I couldn't ask my Sherpa friends, like I said, they were devastated by what had happened. First of all, by Ashwin's loss, but then how their fellow countrymen were beating them up and trying to steal the money and close the mountain. I mean, it was, because they knew people from both sides, so civil war is an ugly thing, and they were kind of devastated by the whole thing. And so basically I just went with, at this point, there was just kind of the Westerners and a Garoon cook. So Garoons are lower down in elevation. They're kind of in the middle hills. And so they're less tied to a lot of the conflict. So basically we just brought some support people for the middle elevation, for the base camp. And I was just going to have to guide everything on this one. But it was only 7,000 meters, kind of a straightforward, much easier peak to do. So it was going to be pretty good. But we had one person who got really sick, and two of the people were worried about what would happen climbing with her. And so they decided they wanted to kind of do their own thing. And so that got us down to basically a team of 3. And so we, me and this one other guy, Jake, a super strong climber. And just an amazing human being, really great guy. So he and I hauled loads up and established Camp 1 and then a Camp 2. And the whole time we know the monsoon's coming, because people always summit Everest between May 20th and June 1st. I mean, you'll see sometimes a little earlier, sometimes a little later. But those are basically, that's your window. There's about a 2-week window when you can climb. And we knew that 2-week window was getting close to being over, because we'd had to get the permits. We'd had to go to Annapurna. We did the Annapurna trek and so forth to get to where we needed to be. So, we got Camp 2 established, and so we kind of were like, all right, well, what are we going to do here? We got this Camp 2 established. And Jake and I brought a bunch of gear up there, so we had everything ready. And so we looked around, looked at the camp. I was like, all right, this is a safe place. We can, it's a good location. We walked the perimeter, sort of felt good about it. And so because she was having issues, he was like, all right, I'll take her back down so she doesn't go alone, and you just stay up here. And then I was like, I said, well, I'll collect the samples, because we wanted to sample all the way up. So I was like, I'll collect samples, really get camp established here, and then you guys can go down. She can rest for a couple of days and then come back up. And so that's what we ended up doing. So we goes to sleep. I go to sleep. I wake up the next day, and it's beautiful, beautiful day. I'm like thirsty because we got in late. We had hauled all this stuff, done all this stuff. So I was super thirsty. I was like, all right, I'm gonna get up. I'm gonna get some snow to melt for my water, and as well as I'm gonna boil some, make some coffee, just sit and relax. And I'll start processing the samples, because the samples take hours to process. So I was like, all right, get out, go do this. It'll take 30 minutes. Then I'll come back and spend my day doing my science. So I start walking away from the tent towards where I wanted to sample. And I'd gone a decent ways, but not very far. And all of a sudden, it's like bright sun, like hurting my eyes. It's so sunny. And suddenly it's just pitch black. I'm like falling. You know how when I don't know if you've ever, if you're in an airplane and it suddenly loses elevation and your stomach goes up, rises, that's the way it felt like. I could feel I was free falling. And it was one of those things where my mind as a climber is like, there's only one reason you free fall, and you don't live through it. You just fell in a crevasse. And so just, split second thoughts were going through my mind of, all right, well, that's basically I'm dead. And I'm bouncing back and forth on the two sides of the crevasse as I'm going down. And then all of a sudden it's just, oof, and I feel pain. And I'm just laying there, and if you've ever had the wind knocked out of you, I had the wind knocked out of me. So you're just trying to find a way to breathe and figure out, what the heck's going on. I finally catch a breath, and I'm laying there on the piece of ice going, what just happened? And I sort of look down at my legs, and they're just dangling over this huge, like 100-foot deep void. And I'm just kind of halfway wedged onto a little block of ice that's wedged in the middle. So I crawled, kind of, and I can't move my arm. I'm laying on this one arm, and I can't move, that like half of my body. And so I have to like get my ice axe and just pull myself onto the ledge and then figure out what the heck I was going to do. So, like I said, I didn't have much with me. The only thing I basically had was my ice axes because I was going to collect samples, and I always carry the axes in case something like this would happen. And then I had my camera so that I could, because normally, and my GPS, because I was going to GPS where the samples were. And I normally take, as part of my science, I take a picture of the GPS, and I take the 8 directions, the north, south, east, west, northeast, southeast, so forth. And so a big part of what I do is taking pictures to record it. And so I was down there sort of looking around, trying to figure out what the heck I was going to do. And I just didn't really even know. I was sort of facing one direction, looking up at the hole, and I could see off to my right, it belled out. And so it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And the snow was like sort of stuck my ice axe out experimentally, and it was kind of like whipped cream. Because basically what would happen is warm or moist air would come across and it would fall down the crevasse. And as it fell, it frosted basically. So it was like the whole crevasse was covered in frosting. And so if you tried to like swing an axe in it, it would just slide because you couldn't get deep enough to actually hit the, well, you could, you just had to dig in deep. But so it wasn't a very good thing. So I knew I was probably, and especially because I couldn't use my right arm. And so
well, let me stop you there because you're sort of glancing over the injuries that you had. You were down 70 some odd feet.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to figure out what to do. And I thought, well, let me take some pictures because, when I get out of this, my friends are going to bust my balls and say, oh, it wasn't that bad. It was probably only like 10 feet. But also more than that, I wanted, because I was hurting and I was like, well, I'll take pictures. I want my mom and family to be able to see, where I was at and what I was doing. So I took a few pictures and then they were just like, it was dark. You couldn't see anything. I was like, all right, let me see what a movie looks like. And I flipped it over to movie and the lighting, it just was incredible. So I was like, all right. And so, normally when I take a movie as part of my research, I explain what I'm seeing. And it actually turned out to be incredibly, I don't know if therapeutic's the right word, but calming, because I was like, well, yeah, I just fell on this hole and, well, what am I going to do? All right, well, let's talk through this. And I looked over to the one side. I was like, that's too big. I can't go that way. I look over here. It actually looks like it gets narrower if I go to my right, and maybe I can stem. And because I knew I couldn't, I tried to pick up my arm. I was like, all right, yeah, this arm is done. And the reason was because when I was falling, I had my ice axe. And so I'd always envisioned, like in the movies, you throw your arm out and you hook the ice axe. Yeah, and it was just in agony. If you've ever dislocated your shoulder, I mean, I dislocated it, ripped it totally out of the socket. And even when I got back to the hospital, that was one of the first things they were trying to do, because I was just like, oh, my shoulder, can you guys relocate it? And they were like, oh, let's try and relocate it. And they're trying to like get it back in, and they're like going, and I'm screaming. And finally they're like, oh, just put him under it. And I guess it took them like 20 minutes to get back in because so much stuff had ripped.
Well, let's go back to the crevasse.
Oh yeah, sorry.
So you're down there, you're on the block, you've taken sense of where you're at, you actually film it, the scientist in you takes over, but your shoulder's dislocated, something in the arm's broken, you have internal bleeding. If I remember, your ribs are cracked, many of them.
Yeah, I had 6 broken ribs. And then I had a bunch of broken vertebrae as well. And thankfully, they were non-displaced fractures. And so I had 6 broken vertebrae. And it hurt the shoulder, but it didn't impair my ability to use the other arm or my legs. I had sort of smashed the one knee, and it was bleeding. So I would just leave blood the whole way up. But my legs were working fine. So that if I hadn't had working legs and at least one working arm, same thing, I never would have gotten out of there. I was super lucky. And it was early in the morning, so it was bright sun, even all the way down as low as I was. I mean, it was cold as heck. And it was before I started doing the video. That was kind of like when I was just initially thinking it through, I'm like, all right, can I climb out? I can't go that way. I can't move my arm. And then I started thinking, well, can my team save me? They're going to come back in 2 days. I'm like, and I'm breathing and I can see my breath, and I look down and I can see my gloves are already icing over, because down in that crevasse, it was like a meat storage locker. It was probably, I don't know how cold it was, but it was incredibly, incredibly cold. And I knew, a few hours at most was all I was going to last down there. And then I thought about my team again, since the woman was having so many issues, she wouldn't be able to lend much assistance. So, and I knew Jake couldn't do it by himself. So I knew I had to get out there. There were no other options. And I was like, I'll take a couple pictures before I leave, and then started talking. And again, that's what really kind of calmed me down. It was like the scientist, the focused thinker took over. And I was like, all right, here are my options. What can I do? How can I approach this? All right, I got to go that way. And so then each time I would stop, I was doing the same thing, trying to get, kind of pictures of where I was. And I found it very soothing maybe, or it helped me focus kind of at the same time.
How did you physically move through that crevasse to get to the narrow parts?
Well, so basically it was effectively 2 sheets of ice. And every once in a while there were chunks of ice sort of stuck between them. And so I would just move from one chunk of ice to the next one. And thankfully they kind of went up. But so I was just ice climbing. So I was ice climbing on a vertical sheet of really hard ice. And, it was 200 feet below me. So I'm doing kind of a, WI4, WI5 moves, free soloing, with a basically death below me. So, and so I would just try and I'm at 6,000 meters or 20,000 feet. So every breath, you're just like, like breathing like somebody running a sprint or something, or a marathon. And, of course, with cracked ribs and blood filling up my chest, incredibly difficult. And so I would just try and go I couldn't go fast because I couldn't make a mistake. And so as expeditiously as possible, I would move from block of ice to block of ice. And like I said, I got lucky that they were kind of moving upward until eventually I reached kind of the fresher part of the crevasse. And so the old parts, it had separated and they were just super rock hard ice. And then they had that kind of whipped cream on top of them as the air deposited its moisture. And so as I began to move towards that narrower part, I got to the fresher and fresher stuff. And so I reached a point where there was no more of the whipped cream, which was good, but it also was all freshly fractured. And so whereas earlier I had just been putting my axe in and it was solid ice, now I would put an axe in and just pull it down and all the loose stuff would come tumbling down. I felt like a bull in a china shop. I was just constantly ripping it down to look for something hard enough to sink an axe in. But on the flip side, there were footholds and stuff. So it wasn't as much degree of difficulty. But the key was, it was in order to reach where it was so narrow, it was only 70 feet straight up, but it was probably 400 or 500 feet I had to go to the right. I look back on the footage and I recognize it pretty well. And yeah, I can't even see where I began. It's one of those things where as I look at the past footage and, oh yeah, I remember that landmark and so forth. And yeah, it was a long trip to the right effectively, because the whole time I was sort of facing the one side. So
plus you're racing time, aren't you? Racing daylight?
Sort of, but again, because it was probably 8 or 9 when I fell in. So to be honest, that never even entered my brain in terms of racing daylight. It was more racing the cold, because I could feel, my hands seizing up and just everything getting colder and colder. And granted, I'm using every ounce of energy I have, so that kind of kept me warm. But again, I don't have anything on. All I was wearing was just a light T-shirt, a pair of wind pants, and just a little jacket, kind of liner gloves. So I'm in, these incredibly cold conditions with utterly inadequate gear. I was only expecting to be out 15 minutes in the sun. So the thing I got really lucky with was I had my big 8,000 meter boots. And so my feet never got cold, I had 100% use of my feet and lower legs. And that is what I spent most of the time on. Yeah, I had my crampons. Yeah, I had the crampons on that one. And yeah, I was just front pointing the whole way for the first quite a bit of it. So once I reached that one area, I kept going through all that broken stuff, and it kept getting narrower and narrower. And finally, at one point, I could just lean back, and I was on the wall, and I was like, thank goodness. And so then I started climbing sort of straight up, but there was this huge block of ice above me that I was afraid I would knock down. So I moved over, climbed up a little bit, and there was another smaller block of ice that was similar. And I thought, well, all right, I'll just kind of knock it to one side. And instead it fell down, and it almost knocked me back all the way back down where I began. So I kept having to move to the right to avoid all this stuff. And finally I reached a point where it was like this big a hole, but the snow was only a couple inches deep. So the light was coming through, so I could see it was the surface. And so I just finally could reach it and kind of pull the snow out of the way. And it felt like I was digging myself out of my own grave. And suddenly then there was light. It was wonderful. But at the same time, that little opening, it was kind of belled like this. And so I get up there to the opening, and I start wiggling my way out. And I get out to about my waist, and my legs are splayed as far as they can go. And I'm stuck because it's all fresh kind of powder up there. And so all I needed was one spot where I could hook an ice axe, like one solid piece of ice, but instead I would just swing the axe and it would just slide through the snow. So it was like, if I made a mistake getting out, I'd go all the way back down, and I obviously wouldn't come back out. So, and it took a minute or two just to psych myself up and be like, it's this or die. And so it was just one of those things where I pulled my legs up as high as I could and just sort of 1, 2, 3, and just sort of dived like a belly flop onto the snow and threw my axe out as far as I could and sunk it and pulled myself so that I wouldn't fall back into the crevasse. And that was actually one of the worst times. And finally I was like, dude, I'm out. I feel good. I'll go back to camp and call for help. And so I tried to stand up. And that's when I realized that I was still a long way from being alive, because I stood up and immediately just fell. And I've played rugby for 20 hours straight. I've done so many crazy sports things and climbing things. And I've never been that utterly, absolutely depleted to the point where I couldn't stand up or walk. And so I had to, so I was thinking it was going to be like 20 minutes back to the tent, or not even that, 5 minutes back to the tent. And instead it took hours. I had to drag myself down the hill because I was kind of on this little bit of a rise to the camp. And just drag myself down that hill slowly over the hours. And then I started wondering about the light, because I knew that, a helicopter can't fly at night. So I knew it was going to take a helicopter to get me out. And then I started thinking about it. I was like, well, because Nepal is 12 hours different from the U.S. And so I knew that because it was 3 or 4, everyone was going to be asleep. And so there was no one I could text and sort of say, hey, are you, I need a helicopter, send the cavalry. And on the flip side, I didn't have a sat phone because we were, we're a nonprofit science group, so we didn't have money on a fancy cell phone. And so we had a satellite texter. And the way the text was set up was I would send updates into Facebook. And so I thought, that'll actually work out well. I'll send the update to Facebook, and then whoever's awake when they finally see it, they'll start getting help. And so I sent it was like Twitter. You only get 144 characters or whatever it is. And so I had to send probably 4 or 5 of these little updates. And sure enough, somebody from Hawaii was awake. And Rebecca Cole works at the University of Hawaii and is on our board, and has been a super, she's led a bunch of our expeditions and just an incredible person too. And she was thankfully awake and basically called in the cavalry. Was like, oh crap, and got a helicopter ordered. But by the time we got everything taken care of, it was getting dark, and so they were like, well, we'll come get you in the morning, but there's nothing that can be done this evening. So I knew I was going to have to somehow survive that night, and hopefully, I knew I was bleeding internally, but I didn't know how bad or if I'd be able to survive it or not.
Long night?
The longest of my life for sure. I was lucky because I had brought some painkillers, and so that helped deal with the pain to some extent. But the problem was, because I only had one arm, I couldn't, I was dying of thirst. I mean, I had gone out to get water, and then I'd spent, 8 incredibly taxing hours climbing out and then dragging myself back to the tent. So I was as dehydrated as it's possible for a human being to be. And I could hear a little bit of water in the canteen, but I had a Nalgene, and there's just, I was using my teeth. I couldn't get it open. And so for hours, anytime I would move, I would hear the water sloshel, but I couldn't get to it. And it was basically the same with food. All I could do is I found a couple of goos, had those, and that was the only food I had the entire time. So I was, hungry, thirsty, and just in agony because, like I said, my shoulder was dislocated, and I had to basically sit kind of at an angle so that I would encourage my chest to not fill with blood. I was worried if I laid down, the whole chest would fill and I'd die. I had to kind of find the right angle. And I always laughed because once people started waking up and I was able to text with my mom and other people. 2 people told me, oh, whatever you do, don't fall asleep, in case you have a concussion or whatever. And it was just like, boy, there is no way. I'm in way too much pain. I could never even dream of sleeping, It was just in agony. But just like everything, eventually, no matter how terrible something in life is, it always ends. So thankfully, this ended in a good way. Eventually, I heard the helicopter.
What were your thoughts when you heard the whack, whack, whack of those blades coming up?
The helicopter pilot came, and he went to the crevasse and was going to lower a Sherpa down in the crevasse to pull me out of the crevasse. And it was like, what? Where did you hear that from? But it was because, the message has gotten passed along so many times. Because I was telling, everybody, no, I'm in the tent. At that point, I couldn't move. My body was just locked up. And, so I hear the helicopter circle. I hear it go down to base camp. They dropped off the doors and the fuel and everything. And then they come up to me, and they circle that crevasse like 6 times and kind of are hanging out. I'm just like, what are they doing? And then they start flying away. I'm like, oh, my goodness. But like I said, I was close to death, and I couldn't unzip the door. I couldn't do anything. And thankfully, I hear him come back, and the guy sits down, and the Sherpa comes, who was with him, so it was him and a Sherpa. The Sherpa guy comes running and opens the door. He's like, oh, he's in here. And so I'm laying on a sleeping pad, and I'm like, I can't move. And he's like, all right. He grabs the sleeping pad I'm on and just drags me across the snow. And there's all these bumps and everything, and y'all got the dislocated shoulder. I'm like, screaming as we're going. But that's what the pilot told me. He's like, they said you were in the crevasse. We couldn't find you there, and so we figured we didn't know what had happened, and so we were leaving. But then I don't ever like to leave without a client. He was this German guy. I don't ever like to leave without the client. And so I decided just to check the tent just for the heck of it. And I was like, oh, thank goodness he did. Otherwise, well, I'd still be there or whatever. So, it was one of those things that the accident itself was terrible, really bad luck. Again, it was a safe area. We had sort of scouted out. It looked good. Had done basically everything we could. And so it was terrible luck that happened. But then everything that happened afterwards was as good as it could have gotten. I had plenty of light. I had 2 ice axes with me. I was warm enough that I was able to text or get a helicopter on the way the night before. I had the painkillers to survive the night that way. And then the helicopter came back for me. So it's like you look at the things and I feel incredibly lucky at everything that happened.
But what I want to ask you is what about mental training? I mean, on your earlier climbs to Everest, you talked about seeing a number of bodies that are just left on the mountain. They're dead climbers still out there. What separates the climbers under those extreme conditions that simply lay down and die, and those who keep moving and survive? Those who fall down into the crevasse and just give up, and those who get out. What separates those?
Yeah, well, and that really is the $1 trillion question, because and you see it a lot in movies, because the people who win aren't usually the strongest or the fastest or the smartest or best looking or whatever. We always like movies about underdogs, and the reason is because a lot of times underdogs are the ones who actually do win. And I definitely am. I know so many climbers that are better than I am, and I know so many people that can do everything better than I can. But at the end of the day, because I'm not the best, it's forced me to try harder, to compete harder, to push myself further and not accept no for an answer. And so I think that's, at the end of the day, the more used to adversity people are and the more that they've overcome to get somewhere, they're the ones who are more likely to survive. And if they've, everything's come super easy to them and they haven't had to work, then when bad things come, it's really easy just to go, oh, well, someone will save me, or I don't really, they just aren't used to pushing themselves that hard. So, and it really is amazing the difference in who kind of steps forward and, wants to keep going and who doesn't. And that's kind of the only commonality, as I've found, is the more they've had to overcome to get wherever they are, the more, again, resilient they are to facing challenges, and the less likely they are to stop. If you allow yourself to be turned around because it's a bad day, or because the scenery's not as good as you wanted, or if little things turn you around, when the big things come along, you're not ready for them.
What's in store for the future?
That's the COVID question of the century, isn't it? Paul's starting to open up a little bit. The only thing I've been doing is trying to stay fit, stay engaged with search and rescue and other groups, because just because there's no official expeditions, a lot of people are still getting themselves hurt. And so we've had to do a lot of calls, and it's the $1 million question.
So for folks who want to learn more about and follow your research and your expeditions, how can they do that?
The easiest thing is climberscience.com is our webpage, or johnhall.com is my webpage. It has a lot of links to the different things that I work on.
Now, you've written Icefall. Any more books in the works?
I tell you, I thought a lot about it because, with Icefall, I was trying to really think it was kind of approach it from a scientific standpoint, and didn't talk much about the personal aspect. I mean, I did, but, of the people I've climbed with and so forth. So I'd like to get more into to write something that kind of more addresses how we, as climbers who are interested in making a difference in the environment, can actually go out and do that. So more of a instruction manual, more something like Twight's book for kind of citizen science and climber science. So. Excellent.
Well, I hope you'll come back and join us and tell us some more of your stories.
Sounds good. Look forward to it.
Thank you for joining us. We'll see you down the road when we get together again, share a glass of whiskey, and hear more stories of adventure as told by those who live them. Until then, check us out at michaeljreinhardt.com, where you'll find more of my work as an adventure photojournalist. Photos, videos, and articles of interesting people, mysterious places, and exotic cultures from the wild places of the world.